let's get into the heart of holism and holistic thinking. There's so much material to cover here that there's actually going to be an additional part next week, so stay tuned for that. As always, sometimes the best material I save for last as we build up. But if you haven't watched already, make sure you go watch my previous episode called What Are Holons, where we lay the foundation for what we'll be talking about today. So, basically at this point, you should understand that everything in the universe is connected to everything else, in case that wasn't clear. But for a lot of people, this isn't clear because they're looking at the universe through the filter of their selfish ego mind, and this creates distortions and causes us to think unholistically. And when people tend to think unholistically, this leads to pathology, disease, and even evil. In quotes, evil. And that's why this topic is so important, and we'll be going into just exactly what the connection is between lack of holism and evil deeper in this episode. But before we get to that, first, let's define holism in a formal way. If we look at the dictionary, the Oxford Dictionary definition says the following, quote, "It's the theory that parts of a whole are in intimate interconnection, such that they cannot exist independently of the whole, or cannot be understood without reference to the whole, which is thus regarded as greater than the sum of its parts." End quote. So that's basically what it is. The whole key behind holism is this idea of irreducibility. You can't just reduce reality down to a collection of independently existing parts. Because in fact, everything that exists together as a unity. It can't exist otherwise for very deep metaphysical reasons that I've explained elsewhere and that I will elaborate upon some more as we keep going here. But this is the key. See, it's not just that reality is a collection of loose objects. What really matters is the relationships between these objects, not just the objects themselves. It's the relationships and how they interconnect and how they flow and merge into and out of each other, and also the different various levels of subordination and superordination that they are in relationship in, the various hierarchies which lead to holarchies and so on. So holism is the opposite of reductionism or atomism. Reductionism or atomism is the idea that you can treat nature as just a collection of discrete individual objects. And this reductionism is actually an implicit, sneaky, hidden part of the materialistic paradigm, which we've talked about in the past when we talk about metaphysics and we talk about epistemology. The materialistic paradigm is the idea that the universe is real and it's material, it's out there, it's physical, it's external, it's objective, it doesn't depend upon the mind, and these sorts of ideas. A lot of scientists subscribe to this sort of paradigm. Well, it's not just that. It's also the idea that you can just boil everything down to something like atoms, such that a human is nothing other than just atoms. And the planet is just nothing other than atoms. And that everything ultimately is just physics. And that if we can just figure out physics at the quantum scale or whatever, then we will understand all of the universe, and that's going to be it. And everything else is just some sort of epiphenomena or just some sort of second order, third order, fourth order effect from the molecules bouncing around. It's this kind of idea. And then we tend to approach everything in life that way, and it creates all sorts of problems because this is an unholistic way of thinking. And ultimately it leads to many dysfunctions and pathologies, as we'll be talking about. So it's this idea that if we want to understand what a frog is, what we do is we go into the swamp where the frog lives, we yank the frog out of there, we put it in a glass terrarium, and then we study it for a few days, and then we throw it into a blender, blend it up, and we study the juice of the frog, and that's the real essence of the frog. To understand the frog, you got to blend it up and study its juices under a microscope. And there you see the little molecules and proteins, and then you break that up even further. You put it into this sort of centrifuge machine that separates all the different cells and molecules into different layers based upon their size and weight and density and so forth. And then that's how you really understand what the frog is. The frog is really carbon atoms and nitrogen atoms and oxygen atoms, and that's what it is. This is a very unholistic approach to doing science. And this is where science creates a lot of problems for itself. You know, people sometimes say, Leo, why are you so anti-science? I'm not anti-science. I'm actually very pro-science. But I want science done in a holistic manner because the spirit of science is to understand reality as a whole, not to understand little bits and pieces. Because the problem is that just because you understand one bit or one piece of reality does not mean that you have the same kind of understanding as the whole of reality. You can't just stitch together a little bit of, someone blended a frog here and someone did something there and someone understood some molecule there, and then we just stitch all those together and then we understand reality. You can't understand reality that way, and if you think you can, that's an implicit part of your epistemology and metaphysics that you're sneaking in, which you did not actually validate or prove. No scientific study has been done to demonstrate that this is the right way to do science, or that this is the only way to do science, or that this is how you get to truth, or the highest understanding. We've discussed this in my series, Deconstructing the Myth of Science, Part 1, 2, 3. Go check that out if you're interested more about the deep epistemology and metaphysics of how science is done and the various corruptions that exist within science. So you see, look at how much is missed when you blend this frog and you only study its juices. What about how the frog lives? What it eats? How it interacts with other frogs? How it relates to the environment that it's a part of? To even think of a frog as this separate, discrete object, separate from the swamp in which it lives, separate from its other members of its species, and its mates, and its society or community. That already is a deeply reductionistic, unholistic, highly problematic way of understanding a frog. You might think that just by yanking that frog out of its habitat and then studying it inside of a terrarium, that would be better than blending it in a blender. And you're right, that is better. Maybe you play with the frog, you feed the frog, you learn something about the frog that you don't understand by blending it. But even that doesn't really capture the whole of it, because if you really understand the frog, you got to go into the swamp where it lives and study its natural habitat, because the frog is going to behave differently in your lab terrarium than it will in its swamp. And it will behave differently depending on what season it is, what time of day it is, how the rainfall is, whether it's mating season or not. And you might say, okay, Leo, fine. I'm gonna spend more money and I'm gonna go into the swamp. I'm gonna set up a little cubby there, camouflaged in the swamp, and I'm gonna study those frogs that way. But even there, you're not understanding the depth of the problem. Because just you being there in the swamp next to the frog, studying the frog, that already influences the frog's behaviors. And you might say, no, but I'm camouflaged, so it can't. See, but you're assuming that the frog has the primary mode of seeing you through its vision. But what if the frog's got other senses that you don't even know about? Maybe it can hear you. Maybe it can smell you. Maybe it's got some sixth or seventh sense that we don't even know. Maybe it can sense your magnetic signature or your infrared radiation or whatever. You don't know. See, you haven't thought about these things very deeply because your whole approach is very reductionistic. And so ultimately, the fatal flaw of most scientists is that they underestimate the entanglement problem. We've talked about that before. The entanglement problem that exists between the scientist and the subject or object that he's studying. See, in a sense, you're entangled with the frog. Your understanding of what the frog is and how you think about the frog, this is all really, it doesn't exist out there in the frog. It exists in your mind, how you think about the frog. Just the fact that you think of it as this separate, isolated creature is already a sort of a category and a projection and a bias that you're imparting upon the thing you're studying. And then you make various kinds of assumptions about whether you can study this frog in a blender or in a terrarium or in the natural environment or however. See? Now, it's understandable why scientists do this, because reductionism makes your life a lot simpler. You can pare down the problem to some convenient little box and then study it within that little box. This makes it easy to do science. But also, it's a sort of a crippled version of science, because your understanding then becomes very compartmentalized and limited too, you see. And so understand that there's different gradations of science. You can have low quality science, you can have very high quality science, but then the higher quality science is more difficult to do. That's why it's not done. Requires a lot more money. It costs a lot more money to go out into the swamp and live with the frogs there. It's not very comfortable and convenient. It's a lot better from a scientist's point of view to study the frog in a lab. But you know what? A lot of the stuff that is studied in labs isn't actually how it works in the real world, which creates blind spots and biases, and it creates bad science. You know, a lot of scientific research and studies, they are literally done with like college students. Why is that? Because most scientists and academics, they live in a university setting. And of course, what do they have an abundance of, an overabundance of? Eager, free fodder in the form of undergraduate students that they can do surveys on, polls on, research studies. They can drag them into a laboratory, pay them a little bit of money to be lab subjects, their little guinea pigs. And then they experiment on them. But, this leads to biases, because when all of your research and surveys and studies are done on college students, that's a very narrow, unrepresentative sample of the larger population. We're talking mostly about Western kids between the ages of like 18 and 25 that are at these universities. These tend to be affluent. They tend to be more white. They tend to be more secular, non-religious. If they're going to a university, they tend to be more liberal, more progressive, as opposed to conservative. They tend to not represent all sorts of segments of the population. They tend to be within a very narrow band of spiral dynamics stages of development. They tend to have similar cognitive, moral, spiritual development. And then so when you do research on these types of people, you get a very narrow result back. But then scientists tend to just extrapolate that out and say, well, if it's true for my undergraduate students, then it must be sort of true for the whole human race, which of course isn't the case. For example, if you wanted to, as a scientist, to research something like meditation, well, the problem with that is that you might design an experiment, and then you might recruit some of your undergraduate students to participate in that. But the problem is that none of them are going to be very expert meditators. At that age, in that sort of cultural bracket, in that level of cognitive and spiritual development, in Western culture, they're all going to suck at meditation. You see, so you're going to get very skewed results. If you really want to understand the effects of meditation, you got to go like to India and find advanced yogis who are living in caves who have been meditating for 20, 30 years, their entire lives, and then you got to study them and see what they can do. Now there, you'll get totally different results than you will on your undergraduate students, you see. But is the scientist, is the academic really thinking this holistically? And even there, of course, if you just do it in India, you might get skewed results too. You got to go and do it in different countries all around the world if you really want to understand how spirituality works, how meditation works, and so on. So it's tricky. The reality is that it's because reality is so infinitely complicated, it's very difficult to do good science on it, holistic science. So usually we get rather crummy, limited reductionistic science. And as we're growing up and we're going through the education system, we're really indoctrinated into this materialism and this reductionism, this kind of linear analytical way of thinking. School, academia, science, medicine, business, healthcare, government, all of these institutions are infected with this sort of reductionistic linear analytical thinking. They all have a bias towards analysis and division. And you see, as it turns out, your mind can work in different ways. The mind can be very analytical or divisive, using your mind to carve out various categories within reality. That's mostly what you're taught in university and in school, if you remember back. Or the mind can be used in a more unitive fashion, in a more holistic fashion, where you're trying to synthesize and draw connections between things. This is a very different approach, and we're generally not taught this approach in school and in university. It's de-emphasized. Because most of our institutions have certain biases. In school, in academia, in science, in medicine, in business, in government, a lot of times we're using analysis to achieve a certain survival result. We have a certain agenda. And we're not really interested in a holistic understanding of reality. We're interested, for example, in our department, figuring out, like if we're working within quantum mechanics, we're only interested in quantum mechanics very narrowly. We're not interested in biology or chemistry or how they all interconnect with each other. So we compartmentalize into, literally in a university, you'll have all these different departments with various subspecialties. But then what we have is we have a ton of narrow specialists and analysts in the world, but we have very few holistic synthesizers. And this creates a big problem because we have a lot of people with good technical expertise who seem, if you look at it on the surface, they seem like they're very responsible, well-educated, professional people. You'll see them on TV. You'll see these pundits and experts. You'll see scientists with PhDs with Nobel Prizes. They will seem very authoritative. It might be a doctor in a white lab coat. It might be a lawyer. It might be, a judge or whatever. And you think, well, surely these people are like the top intellectuals. They understand what's going on in reality. We should listen to these people and just follow them. But the problem is that most of these people, even though they do have certain technical expertise, it tends to be very narrow and unholistic. And this gets us into a lot of trouble because we have high technical expertise, but very little wisdom. And wisdom, check out my episode, What is Wisdom? I said in that episode, it's a holistic thing. That's one of the features of wisdom, is that it's holistic. And we'll explain a bit more about that as we keep going. So you should start to get a little bit of a sense here why holism is important. Really, that's one of the biggest lessons from this episode, is just start to see how important holism is and how little it is stressed in most institutions and areas within society. And you start to understand why we have so many problems in our society and in the world, both individually and collectively. So, but let's really stress this point as to why holism is so important, because this is the major lesson here for you. Even if you say, well, Leo, yeah, I already know it's important. No, you don't know how important it is. And you don't know how much you're lacking it. Because again, holism isn't just a binary thing. You're either holistic or you're not. There are many degrees of holism. And so our work here is to help you to elevate yourself to the higher degrees and to show you how to do that, which we'll be doing. So, but here's a few examples of why holism is so important. So imagine, for example, that there's something wrong in the body, like with your heart. And let's say I'm the CEO of this corporation. It's a pharmaceutical company, and I want to help people to heal their heart. But in fact, more likely, it's like I want to actually earn a lot of money. That would probably be my first priority if we're realistic about how CEOs run these companies, which is an unholistic way of thinking in and of itself. But let's just focus on healing the heart. So let's say that we want to create a drug that reduces cholesterol and plaque in the heart. Okay, great. So we think that, I tell my scientists, hey, focus on finding me the right chemical that we can manufacture and patent to reduce cholesterol. Go find it. That's Your number one priority, that's all we care about. Just focus on that. And some scientist says, well, but what about other effects of this drug? I say, no, it doesn't matter. We just need this drug by next quarter to, drive up our stock prices. That's what we need. Damn everything else. Focus all your energy on just finding this chemical. And so the scientists go, they obey, because under capitalism, they have to not to starve. So they obey the CEO and they do this. And they find the drug that will do it, this one chemical. And they test it, and it seems to work in these double-blind placebo-controlled studies, works, cures people's heart disease and so forth. Great, right? Except, what if this chemical creates cancer in the kidneys or in the liver? See, in order to catch that, you would have to think more holistically. You'd have to think of this chemical not only affecting or curing one part of the body, but also, not only does it have to cure the heart problem, it has to also not cause other problems in the body. And there are thousands of other problems it could potentially cause, and it would be difficult to study all those problems and to eliminate them as side effects. Sometimes the drug can have worse side effects than the disease that it's curing. But that's not all. See, you might say, well, okay, fine. If the CEO is a little bit more holistic in his understanding, he's a little bit smarter, he has to tell his scientists, don't just look for a drug that heals the heart, but also doesn't damage any of the other parts of the physical body. Well, that's better. That's certainly a better approach. And through that method, we might find some new chemical which both heals the heart and doesn't cause cancer or other diseases anywhere else in the body. Okay, good. But notice how limited this still is. Because see, when you're manufacturing a drug, it's not just about the physical body, it's also about the mind. And if you have a very materialistic approach, a very reductionistic approach to human health, you might think, well, damn the mind. I'm not in the, as a CEO, I'm not in the business of healing people's minds. I don't care about their minds. I care about their bodies. That's my business. Everything else, that's for psychologists to think about the mind. That's for their guru to worry about. That's not my job. Okay, but then what if this drug that was invented, it doesn't harm any of the body, but when you take it, you get depression after a few months. And then this depression becomes very bad, and maybe even this drug has some addictive qualities, such that even after it's cured your heart disease, you still keep taking it. And then this leads people to commit suicide from this depression. Now, the CEO might compartmentalize this and say, well, that's not my concern. That's not my business. Let him go to a therapist and work out his depression. But what if the chemical is actually causing the depression? And also there's addiction there. See? If your thinking is not holistic, you can compartmentalize that problem and you can ignore it and you can deny it. And you can make a lot of money selling this drug. But if you have a more holistic approach, you might say, oh, damn, we could have earned $10 billion selling this drug, but we can't. We have to look for something else because this drug causes depression in people, and I care about that because I'm a more holistic sort of leader and CEO. How many CEOs would make that difficult decision? Not very many, not these days. Not to say they couldn't, but they just, as part of their culture, they wouldn't. Because their responsibility is more for driving up stock prices than it is for caring about people's psychological well-being. But it doesn't stop there. It's also about how we market this drug. Even if this drug is fine and doesn't cause depression and so forth, the way we market it very aggressively, how we price the drug, pricing out people who don't have the money for it, for example, or marketing it so aggressively that people who don't need the drug end up taking the drug and it causes bad effects in them. So it might heal those people who are actually sick, but then it causes more disease and problems in those who aren't sick, but we push the drug so hard through television ads and various kinds of free giveaways that they do through doctors and so forth, that we create harm that way. And then there are all sorts of secondary and tertiary cascading effects from that. You see, it's going to affect your country, your citizens, your neighbors. your community that you live in. Such that maybe you sell this drug to somebody who doesn't need it, they get addicted to it, they get depressed from it, then they go buy a AR-15, then they go shoot up a school, and it turns out that that school is where your daughter was going. And she gets shot. And see, now you can fully appreciate how everything in the universe is deeply interconnected, and that you can't just treat it as though it's not your problem. In a sense, everything is your problem. And so part of what it means to be a holistic thinker is that it requires taking much more responsibility for all of your actions and all of the secondary and tertiary consequences. But the way that many leaders and business people operate these days is very much unlike that, because it doesn't serve them. It doesn't serve their survival. It doesn't serve their pocketbook to be this holistic, because then you have to take a lot of responsibility for your actions of your business. You see? So this is just one example of how deeply problematic this sort of lack of holism can be. And also it shows you why there's a sort of a perverse incentive for people to be deliberately unholistic in their thinking. You'll find if you start to practice holism that the more holistic you become, the more difficult it is to actually do certain things in life, because you can't do them for the fact that you're conscious of how responsible you are and what collateral damage this would do to everyone in the universe that you feel connected with. And the more beings in the universe you feel connected with, the more carefully you have to tread through the universe. You can't just, walk through a forest stomping on every creature that's under your foot without giving a damn. That makes it difficult to walk through a forest or to drive your Hummer through a forest, trampling squirrels and bugs as you go. Here's another example of why holism is important, and this one is about Star Wars. If you're a fan of Star Wars like me, at least the original trilogy or the second, I like all the Lucas trilogies. I mean, there were problems with the prequels, but still way better than what Disney has done with the trilogy. So if you've seen what Disney has done with the Star Wars trilogy, and I haven't actually even watched it, I've just watched the reviews because I knew that they were gonna butcher it and break my heart, so I didn't even bother watching it. But the whole problem with the Disney trilogy, it's a total mess. Because, see, the original Star Wars was designed by one visionary, George Lucas. And he had sort of an overarching vision, a holistic vision for what Star Wars would be. And in fact, it was so much material, such a long story that he had to break it up into multiple episodes. That's where the trilogy came from. So it sort of evolved organically from the sort of quality and depth of the story he wanted to tell. But with Disney, why did they want a trilogy? Did they even know? No. They just bought it from Lucas, and they just wanted to maximize the profits. That was like their only concern. They didn't have a holistic vision for what Star Wars could be, or how it tied in with the old trilogy, or how it'll tie in with future trilogies. They didn't care about anything. In fact, they couldn't even construct one overarching story arc for the trilogy. They gave each episode in the trilogy to other different directors and different writers, such that there was never a single cohesive vision. I mean, it's the height of stupidity to do this with your brand, probably one of the most popular brands on the planet, with loyal fans who will get their hearts broken if you don't treat the trilogy properly and, have an overarching vision for what the episodes are going to be, a nice arc with nice conclusions. None of that was done for the Star Wars trilogy. Why not? Because they don't have a holistic approach to this creative challenge, right? That's one of the functions of a visionary, is that the visionary brings to a project this overarching holistic sense of direction of what they're doing, of vision. And without that, you just have a bunch of people doing stuff, slapping stuff together, hoping that it'll lead to something magical and beautiful, and usually it doesn't. So notice how various forms of entertainment, fall to this problem. Maybe some of your favorite brands or your favorite franchises have fallen prey to this, whereas originally there was some higher vision that led to some sort of magical, beautiful game or story or set of novels or a set of movies or a TV series or whatever. And then later, that visionary died or went off doing his own thing. And then the people who took over it, they had no vision. And then they're just slapping stuff together. And when you slap a bunch of characters and things together, like with Star Wars, if you just slap some laser swords and some Jedis and some evil Sith people, you slap them all together, it does not equal the same thing as the original Star Wars. You can't just reduce Star Wars to that. When you do, you lose something that's greater than the sum of its parts. You see? Or consider another example of why holism is important. Consider who wins or loses at chess. If you're a bit of a chess fan like I am, I used to play it a lot when I was younger, not so much these days, but I still enjoy a good chess game or even watching YouTube videos of some of the classic, chess games of grandmasters. There are some beautiful games you can watch. What are the most beautiful chess games? The most beautiful chess games are those in which some sort of a deep sacrifice is made, only to come out with a checkmate at the very end, despite the sacrifice. So, for example, sacrificing your queen to lure in your opponent, to make him think that, he has outsmarted you, but actually that's all part of a larger plan you have to outsmart him. So in chess, the one who wins is the one who has the most holistic understanding of the board in that particular game. That's who wins. So really, chess, in a sense, is a battle for holistic understanding of that particular scenario. And those who are geniuses at it, and the most beautiful games that you can find online and so forth, of the grandmasters, you'll see this. You'll see that they're thinking 10, 15 moves ahead, and they're making these gambits and making these brilliant plays which are highly intuitive. And intuition, of course, is directly related to holism, which we'll elaborate upon a little bit more later in this episode. But they're using this profound, powerful intuition in order to synthesize all the possible strategies and then to come up with this sort of a brilliant, overarching strategy that is supposed to lead to a checkmate. So we see this over and over again with various situations in life where, in a sense, people who are unholistic, they paint themselves into corners easily. Just in the way that you can paint yourself into a corner if you're sort of a fool at playing chess. You can be easily fooled. Like there's actually something called a fool's mate. It lures you in. You think you're going to quickly win something, and then actually you lose very fast, like that. And so what I'm talking about, it might sound like what I'm talking about are these large societal problems with science or with healthcare or something like that. But a lack of holism is also a problem just in your personal life, because you easily paint yourself into a corner in your personal life as well by a lack of holistic thinking. But now we get to the heart of this episode. Here's what I really want you to learn. This is the most important part. I'm going to give you two equations here. These are the sort of master equations that explain all of life. These are very profound. You should write these down in your notes and contemplate them for years, because you will get payoff from this. So I'm going to give you the two equations, and then I'm going to go into a lot of elaboration upon the terms, because I could talk about these terms and how they equate with each other for hours, but we don't have that much time, so we'll have to summarize. All right, so the first equation is this. Holism equals wholeness, equals health, equals healing, equals unity, equals oneness, equals the infinite, equals harmony and balance, equals goodness, equals love, equals God, equals selflessness, equals wisdom, equals beauty, equals holy, equals heaven, equals bliss. And then the second equation, which is the flip side of the first equation. A lack of holism equals division, equals fragmentation, equals partiality, equals brokenness, equals a lack of harmony and balance, equals limitation, equals the finite, equals selfishness, equals the ugly, equals evil, equals hell, equals suffering. All right, so now let's explain. So when we're talking about holism, what we're really talking about is seeing the biggest picture or the highest whole. We're also talking about health because, as it turns out, health is nothing other than harmony or balance within the highest whole. So, for example, when we say that the human body is healthy or it's not healthy, it's diseased or it's broken, what are we really saying? A healthy human body, that's nothing other than to say that all the different parts in the body are in balance with each other and working synergistically in harmony for the greater good of the whole of the body. And if some part is out of order, out of harmony, doing something selfish, it's misbehaving, then we say that's a broken body. There's disease in that body. One part of the body is fighting some other part of the body, like with cancer or with autoimmune or whatever. There's literally division within the body. The body is at war with itself. It's divided against itself, as in the case with cancer. These cancer cells are selfishly, in a divisive, partial, broken way, trying to multiply themselves. But eventually what happens if that keeps going, it ends up being self-terminating because the cancer overtakes the body, destroys the good parts of the body that are needed to function. And then, of course, that also destroys the host and the substrate that the cancer itself needs in order to live. And so not only does the cancer kill all the rest of the organs, it also kills itself at the very end. And so this is a pathology. This is brokenness. It's unsustainable. It's a selfish strategy, we might say. The cancer in this case is being too selfish. It doesn't want to limit itself to play well with the rest of the body and to keep itself in check. It's out of balance. And so what does it mean to heal the body? To heal the body literally means to bring different parts of your body into balance with themselves. To remove the divisions into a unity or oneness, you see. Similarly, what does it mean for a human being to be evil or pathological within society? See, disease can exist within your body, but disease can also exist within society at large. A disease within society is when certain human beings or groups of human beings are behaving in an unbalanced, unharmonious way, a selfish way, where they're dividing and fragmenting society, leading to brokenness, leading to suffering, which makes the society unstable, and eventually it could destroy the society. For example, think of Adolf Hitler. What does it mean to say that Adolf Hitler is evil? A lot of people would call him evil. He's not really evil. Evil is just, as I've talked about in the past, evil is just a relative designation. What does it really mean to say that Adolf Hitler was evil? It wasn't that he was some, morally demonic person. It was just that he was very selfish. He got indoctrinated with a very limited, partial, divisive ideology when he was growing up in Germany at that time, and it was a challenging time for Germans in that era. after their defeat in World War I. And so the German population felt demoralized, they felt victimized, and so various kinds of toxic ideologies were developed that were anti-Semitic, that were anti-Marxist, anti-communist, and so there was a sort of a swing of the pendulum very far to the right within German politics, and Hitler got wrapped up in this propaganda. He read a lot of these sort of magazines and listened to these radio programs and whatever, and got involved in this sort of toxic ideology of Nazism. And this led to a lot of, it was filled with racism and hatred and all of this. And this was a very selfish way of thinking about reality, right? Why is it selfish? Well, because it's like, it's me and my people, the German people, the pure people, versus those dirty others over there who are depraved and evil, and it's the Jews and the communists who are trying to degrade the Germans and infect our German blood with their bad genetics and whatever else and their bad ideas. And so it's this us versus them, this divisionary, fragmentary, very broken way of seeing reality. And then when you project the divisions of your mind onto reality, which is what Hitler did, then that's how you see, because your reality is intertwined with your mind, such that whatever you think influences what you see out there. And then so this leads to a very fragmentary worldview, and then that leads to very fragmentary actions. And so, of course, that's just what World War II was. It was just a series of divisive and fragmentary and selfish actions that destabilized the whole world, brought it out of balance, and then it had to be put back into balance by ultimately defeating Hitler. And it was ugly. People called it evil. For many who suffered through it, it was hell. It was hell both for the Germans who had to fight. It was hell for the Jews. It was hell for the Russians and the Americans and the British and everybody else who fought in it. It was hell for many folks. It was hell for those at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was hell in the East. It was hell in the West. It was full of suffering. It was ugly. It was brutal. It was broken. That's what selfishness leads to. At the individual level, Hitler was not a happy guy. It wasn't that there was just brokenness within the German society. It was also he was a broken guy. So the brokenness of the German society was a reflection of his own inner brokenness. But consider how it could have gone. It could have gone where Hitler recognized, maybe somebody told him, he watched some Actualized videos or something, somebody told him that, hey, you've got these fragments in your mind, the way that you're thinking about reality. When you're fragmenting reality into, the Germans versus the non-Germans, the non-Aryans, the Semites versus the anti-Semites, the communists versus the nationalists. When you're doing this, you're creating these divisions, and this is actually disunifying reality and leading to disease. What if instead we healed these divisions in your mind, such that your mind was unified and you weren't at war with the rest of the world? And maybe that would have to start by healing the divisions within you. Maybe there are aspects of you that you have disowned and denied and demonized that need to be loved. Maybe you need to give up certain selfish attachments and fears that you have. And as you do that, you become more selfless. You become more in balance with your own self. You become a better human being, a more compassionate human being who is cognizant of how one's mind influences what one sees and what one receives back from reality. And you think more holistically about the kind of beliefs and ideologies that you've been programmed with. You let those go. And as you do that, you experience more unity, more love. You literally become healed. Your body becomes healthier. Various kinds of ailments and diseases that you have will go away as you do that, as you fight less with yourself. And then you will fight less with others around you as well, because you'll recognize that they are just a part of a larger system that we're all a part of, that we're all in the same boat together, and that none of them are really your enemies. And as you do that, you will see the beauty of life more. And instead of experiencing suffering, you will start to experience temporary moments of bliss and heaven. And eventually, if you keep going and going and going, you raise your consciousness more and more and more. You become more conscious of how much everything in reality is interconnected. At some point, your consciousness will actually go from finite to infinite as your mind becomes completely unified and healed into a oneness, and you will realize that you're not just a part of the universe, you are one with the universe. You are the universe. And when you recognize that, furthermore, your consciousness goes even more infinite, and you realize that the universe is actually you as God dreaming up this dream in your own mind. And when you recognize that, you realize yourself to be holy. And everything around you becomes holy. And that's the discovery of spirituality. True spirituality. That's all that spirituality really is it's a healing of divisions and biases and partiality within your own mind to such a radical extent that eventually your mind becomes completely unified and one, such that even the division between subject and object, me and you, us and them, all these divisions get so healed and so unified that literally you merge into the universe and you realize that the whole thing is God. A holy, absolute unity, or infinity, or love. And then you align your life with that most holistic of consciousnesses. Or you could go the other directions. You could go into the selfish direction. That was the selfless direction. You could go into the selfish direction and you could just double down on your partiality, your biases, your selfishness, your desire to survive and to dominate others. And then you can live that very limited way of life and you become more and more entangled in selfishness. And then you suffer more and more from it, and then your life becomes a living hell. And then eventually you might even need to kill yourself, the way that Hitler did. Once, he's backed all the way into the corner that he painted himself into. This is it. I just gave you the two master equations of life. This is what all of reality and all of life is about. Consciousness can have various levels of holism to it. Really, it's an infinite scale, from infinitely unholistic and fragmented and divided to infinitely unified and everything in between. And depending on where you are on this scale is going to be the quality of your life and how beautiful and holy life seems to you. As an individual, but also us collectively, as a species. As a species, the more unified we are, the more holistic we are, the more beautiful our societies will be. The more beautiful our cities will be, the less war we'll have, the more peace we'll have. I should have really included peace as part of this first equation, because all of that stuff equals peace. That's how you get peace. Through unification. But see, it's tricky because there are many orders of unification. Unification needs to happen not only at the individual level, also at the family level, also at the local community city level, also at the level of your state, at the level of your country, at the level of the globe, at the level of all races, at the level of all species. So you see, we're going through the holons that we talked about in What Are Holons episode. We're going through these holons higher and higher and higher until we reach an infinite unity. And this is what human history has been about for the last 10,000 years, is that we've been unifying at smaller scales. At first we unified as tribes, then we unified as city-states, then we unified as nations. Now we're starting to unify as the globe, but a lot of people are resistant to this idea of a unified global collective of humans. People are nationalistic. They want to just unify only with their nation. And this, of course, leads to war and genocide and all sorts of other problems. Because the reality is that anything short of infinite unity is going to lead to suffering, ugliness, and limitation. So the whole point of spiritual work is to let go of all your partialities, all of your divisions, and that means becoming more selfless. But of course, that's the most difficult thing to do. And when you become completely selfless, if you ever achieve this, then you realize that you're God. Because God is nothing other than infinitely selfless consciousness. Whereas the reason you don't realize you're God right now is because you're in a divided, highly fragmented, highly partial sense of consciousness. So you think you're a little human. That's separate from the universe. That's separate from other humans. That's separate from other animals. That's separate from other planets and solar systems and things. That's the level of consciousness you're at right now. That can change. Changing that is the function of spirituality. Powerful stuff, right? Make sure you write down these equations and you contemplate them deeply. I'm telling you how to heal the world right here. I'm telling you how to heal yourself. You know, there are entire mental disorders that have to do with just fragments, severe fragmentation of one's psyche, like schizophrenia or multiple personality disorders. There are people who literally have like multiple personalities, multiple egos. You think having one ego is bad? They have multiple egos fighting inside their skulls. And of course, this leads to very dysfunctional ways of living. And so what's the solution to these sorts of disorders? Well, again, it's to unify. It's to unify the various parts of your psyche. And don't think that these are just extreme people who live in psychiatric wards. You also suffer from a certain degree of multiple personality disorder because your ego is not fully unified. Your ego is fragmented. And this is very easy to tell because, you know, one day you're all gung-ho about meditating and self-actualizing and eating healthy and going to the gym. And then the next day you're lazy and you don't go to the gym and you eat a bucket of ice cream and you don't want to self-actualize and you have a giant ego backlash. What's going on there? Well, there are multiple parts within your psyche that you haven't harmonized yet. There's that part of you, the reptilian brain part, that wants food and sex and pleasure and to be lazy. And then there's that part of you that's aspirational. The spiritual part of you, the higher self, that wants to self-actualize, that wants to eat healthy, that wants to be successful, that wants to be spiritual, that wants to pursue the truth and beauty, and it wants to love. But then this part of you is too afraid to love. And so now there's a war between which one will allow. Well, one day one wins out, another day the next wins out. That's why you have fights with your family or with your loved ones, with your spouses and girlfriends and boyfriends. That's why you struggle to self-actualize and to grow, because there's this tug of war within you. There might be wounded parts within you. Maybe you got bullied as a child or abused or ridiculed. And then that wounded part of you has like fragmented and been severed from the rest of your psyche, such that normally you function pretty well, but then something once in a while will trigger you, and then you will regress back, and then that little part of you that's been wounded, it'll come out like a monster from its cage, and then it'll overtake, you know, the normal reasoning part of you. It'll overtake that, and it'll turn you into a monster for a day or two. And that will keep happening until you learn to heal this part. Literally, see, and the mistake that's made here is that people will say, oh, well, that part of me is bad and evil, so I'm going to just hit it and punish it. I'm going to guilt myself for having that part. You know, I'm going to guilt myself for wanting food and sex, and I'm going to force myself never to have sex again, and I'm going to never masturbate, and I'm going to never eat bad food, and I'm just going to be perfect all the time. But then this doesn't work, because what you've done is you've demonized and actually further fragmented the good part of you from the bad part of you. So you've created this good versus bad dichotomy, and now this just perpetuates the division. You didn't actually harmonize the situation by guilting yourself or shaming yourself over this. And so how do you fix this? Well, with love. Love is what heals. Love is that which can understand and recognize and incorporate and accept, integrate through acceptance, through a higher understanding, right? You might, for example, recognize that, yeah, that part of me when I was little was bullied at school, and I still live with those wounds, but you know what? I'm going to accept my wounds. I'm going to still love myself despite those wounds. I'm going to try to be understanding about, the situation I was in. I was sent to a bad school and there wasn't really a lot I could do. And as you try to do that work, you might even forgive some of those people who bullied you out of a sense of love and holistic understanding. And then you integrate that. And then after some years of doing that kind of therapeutic work, shadow work, speaking of which, I still have to release that episode on shadow work. But yeah, you do that work, and then at one point you heal it. You heal it so much that it merges back together, and then you're whole again, and then you can love yourself again. I just told you how to do shadow work. Don't worry, I'm going to have a dedicated episode on shadow work with more detailed explanations and exercises, but this is the essence of shadow work. Shadow work is just recognizing parts of reality that you've disowned by expanding your consciousness, a more holistic understanding of that situation, incorporating it, integrating it, loving it, accepting it, unifying it until there's no shadow. God is that which has no shadow because it's infinitely conscious of itself. And when you're infinitely conscious of yourself and you recognize that you're infinity, you're one, you're the entire thing, there's no more shadow, and there's no more warring with yourself or with others, because really warring with yourself and warring with others, it's actually the same thing. That's what you recognize. And the higher your consciousness goes, the more unity you experience, the more blissful your life will be. The more loving you will be with others in your life and with yourself, the more you will accept yourself, the more happy you will be. So really, you should add happiness to the first equation as well, because this is how you attain true happiness. And if you take this far enough, your consciousness becomes infinitely unified. You actually will experience literally heaven, paradise. That's what heaven is. And what is hell? Hell is just the absence of love. The deepest hell is when your mind has been, or consciousness has been so limited, so constrained, so fragmented, so divided that it has completely severed itself from God's love, such that you don't even believe there is a God or that there is any love when you're in the deepest hell. So when you tell somebody who's in the deepest hell about love, he doesn't understand it. He doesn't believe you, because there is no love in the deepest hell. And there can't be, because love is literally unity. And in the deepest hell, there's only division. Making sense? Ta-da! These are the equations of life. So unholistic thinking creates duality and division. That's the problem. Let me give you a few examples of how this works. Have you heard this Ben Shapiro quote of facts don't care about your feelings? This is not just popular amongst Ben Shapiro fans, but it's also sort of attitude that even many scientists take, many atheists and rationalists take this sort of attitude that, science doesn't give a fuck about love. Science doesn't care about emotions. Science is just brute numbers and calculations. It's just pure truth. Well, of course, this is absurd. The idea that the rational part of you is separate from the emotional part of you is one of the biggest unholistic ways of thinking about the human psyche. And it's completely false, and it leads to all sorts of terrible pathologies. The fact is that your facts are very much influenced by your feelings. especially in the case of someone like Ben Shapiro or someone who follows him. But even with scientific type people, this is still the case. See, you think that rationality is superior to emotions, and that emotions need to be subsumed under the authority of rationality. But if you live your life this way, this is going to create all sorts of divisions and problems for you. In a sense, it's sort of like severing your head from your heart. And in fact, that's how many of these people live. And then you literally can develop diseases in your body this way. See, we tend to treat the body as though like we can almost cut off the head and stick it into a vat, hook it up to a computer, and the head can just function. I can just keep being me, just if we save the head. But the reality is that you can't really do that. Because even if you could do that, something important would be lost. Because a lot of who you are is in your body, not just in your head. A lot of the emotions and trauma that you carry is in the body. And that's actually what secretly drives you in most cases. It's not the head that usually drives you. It's your emotions and wounds that drive you, which are all subconscious, very deeply subconscious. And then the only part of it you understand is the rationality, and you're using your rationality to, in fact, justify and rationalize a lot of stuff that would change if you took care of those issues in your body. That's why people see a lot of benefit from yoga, from various kinds of body work, energy work, and so on. That's an important facet of personal development. Personally, that's not one of my strengths. I'm a very heady guy, so I don't teach a lot of those sort of energetic body techniques. I have one episode called Body Awareness, so you can go check that out, where I talk a little bit about that. But again, it's not my strong suit. You can find other teachers who will teach you about these sort of more bodily techniques. There's like bioenergetics, there's yogic practices, there's obviously various kinds of physical exercise. I mean, I did share the technique with you called Shamanic Breathing. That's one of these exercises. And if you practice Shamanic breathing even for a few days, as I showed in that video on Shamanic Breathing, you'll see how much powerful stuff comes out of your body just through breathing. So that shows you how facts don't care about your feelings, or this idea that the rational is separate from the emotional. This creates pathology. And that if you want to be a fully well-integrated human, you're going to have to heal that division you made in your mind. And think of where that division came from. It came from your culture. It came from your upbringing. It came from school. In school, they sort of taught you to separate facts from feelings, and the objective from the subjective, the rational from the emotional. This is part of our education system. It's part of the materialistic paradigm. Another example for how thinking creates division and pathology is, excuse me, is there's a popular duality that's been created lately within politics of globalists versus regular folks. The globalist elite versus the ordinary little people. As though such a division really exists in the universe. It doesn't. This is the delusion of many both left-wing and right-wing populist movements, is that they think that they can separate these two. But in fact, there's not that much difference psychologically between elites and regular folk. In fact, I would say that most elites are more educated, they're more conscious, they're more developed, they're actually more loving people than regular folk. That's difficult for many populists to swallow. But if you don't understand this, it will actually lead to a lot of problems within your politics. Your politics simply won't work. Because see, if you think the regular folk are actually better than the elites, and you think that the elites are evil and they're bad and they're all sociopaths and they don't care about anybody except themselves, all they want is money and to rule the world. If that's how you think, which is a popular way to think, some of them are like that. But what you have to understand, though, is that the regular folk, most regular folk are uneducated and they don't have a very high level of development, cognitively, morally, spiritually. If you take some regular folk and you put them into positions of power, they will start to abuse that power even worse than the elites that you despise. Because the regular folk are less well educated. They're more dogmatic and ideological in many cases. They're less open-minded in many cases. and they don't even recognize how corruption can infect them, so they become even more corrupt. And we see this. You see this especially with the recent populist uprisings on the right in America and in other parts of the world. These right populist uprisings, they're very, very low consciousness. These people fool themselves into thinking that they're going to take over the globalist elites, and they're going to, the ordinary people, the ordinary right-wing folk are going to like take over the government and things will go well. No, those ordinary right-wing folk are the most corrupt, the most unconscious, the most fearful, the most hateful, the most racist, some of the most of those in all of society. So it's extremely dangerous to let those people take power. And even though I say that, that doesn't mean I necessarily, defend some of these elitist capitalists. I mean, there's definitely deep corruptions within the elites themselves. But the thing you have to recognize is that no matter how much corruption you see in the elites, the corruption in the lower classes is way worse than it is in the elites. And that's the key mistake that many Trumpists and supporters of Trump and right-wing populism make. And that's exactly really, it's an analogous to the problem that happened with Hitler. See, I mean, Hitler's whole spiel was that he was sort of taking over Germany from the globalist elites on behalf of the regular folk. That was Hitler's whole appeal. It's really not different from Trump's appeal or many of the right-wing populist appeals around the world these days. It's just not, I mean, I'm not saying they're of equal severity. They're not of equal severity. Trump is better than Hitler, but there are definitely deep analogies there. And you see what happens when these right-wing regular folk take over. Bad stuff happens. Now, that does not mean that when left-wing populists take over, bad stuff doesn't happen either. Bad stuff happens all around. Like I said in my wisdom episode, there's a lot of foolishness to go around on both sides, right? So take that into account. How about this sort of division that's created between criminals and the good guys, the upstanding people? This sort of division creates problems and pathologies and disease within society because when we treat criminals as someone who's other than us, we actually create a shadow. Those criminals are then people who we demonize and hate. We don't treat them humanely. And then that just increases their recidivism rates. They get out of jail and they just become even deeper criminals because they're not really reformed, especially, for example, in the American incarceration system, some of it which is for profit and so forth. They actually get much better results in the Scandinavian Nordic countries where they have much more humane prison systems where they actually do rehabilitation rather than punishment. And see, if you think that these criminals are separate from you, you're going to want to punish them and demonize them and hurt them, inflict pain upon them. But by hurting them, that's just going to make them more pissed off and more criminal. Not very wise in the grand scheme of things. Because, most of those criminals have to get out of prison at some point and come back into society. So wouldn't it be better to rehabilitate those people? But to rehabilitate them, to even want to rehabilitate them, you have to open your mind and think holistically about the fact that actually the criminal is not separate from you. They have a lot more in common with you than you think. And in fact, if you want to be totally honest, you yourself are a criminal. How many crimes have you committed in your life? How many laws have you violated? So it's a complete hypocrisy to sit there demonizing criminals while, literally, most of us are criminals in one way or another. We did something criminal at some point in our lives, if we're really honest about it. If we're really holistic, right? If we're really even-minded in the way that we think about things. But see, that's not convenient for many people. For many people, they just want to have somebody to scapegoat, and they'll just scapegoat the criminals. Now, again, I'm not saying that the criminals are angels. Some of these criminals are bad people, and they got to be locked up, not to hurt others. So we don't want to be foolish in the way that we treat criminals. But at the same time, if you take a very holistic approach and you realize that there's not a separation between you and the criminal, and that the criminal elements of society are literally just parts of your own psyche as the universe or as God, you start to treat things very differently with more love and more compassion, and you get better results. And you actually see this borne out in Scandinavian countries. How about the duality that's created between science and spirituality, or science and mysticism? This sort of division has been created in our universities, where anything spiritual or mystical is seen as anti-scientific, and it's really not allowed within universities. It's treated as a joke. It's treated as unscientific. It's treated as some sort of a lack of rigor, lack of truthfulness. And conversely, in many spiritual circles, there's sort of the opposite problem, is that these spiritual people become so new agey and so mystical and schmystical that they start to ignore rationality. They stop thinking. They stop trying to test their own theories. And so right now we sort of have this schism between science and academia on the one hand, spirituality and mysticism on the other hand, and they tend to be two different camps. They tend to not communicate well with each other, and both suffer for that. Science suffers and academia suffers for lack of spiritual understanding and mysticism, because for science to fully flourish and to really understand reality at the deepest level, it needs spiritual insight from meditation and yoga and such things. And it needs to consider deep metaphysical issues which are at the heart of science and which spirituality can shed some powerful light on. For example, the mind-body problem can be resolved through spirituality. It cannot be resolved through materialistic science. But science doesn't understand that yet, so they're stuck. So science is suffering from a lack of unity. Spirituality is also suffering from a lack of unity because spirituality needs a lot more science behind it. Our spirituality would be so much better if we had rigorous science into psychedelics, into yoga, into different meditation techniques, and we applied more scientific methods to these practices. This would help a lot more people become enlightened. So we really need a synthesis of these two, but there tends to be an opposition where each camp gets stuck in its own, bubble, and they don't want to integrate and unify. So as you can see, unholistic thinking creates conflict, fights, violence, war, racism, genocide, slavery, exploitation, and even civilizational collapse can occur from this. Whereas holism interconnects everything, and also what it does, very importantly, is it tells you what is important and what is meaningful in life. So one of the consequences of this materialistic, reductionistic attitude or paradigm that has been adopted by our culture in the West over the last 100 years, especially through the 20th century and still to today, is that it has, in a sense, tried to demystify nature too much. And in so doing, it has stripped life of its meaning or its spirit, such that everything has just become sort of technocratic and analytical, hyper-rational, and pragmatic, to the point where there's nothing more to life than just being pragmatic about everything and just building better technology. And that's it. That's sort of our only connection to life, is with our technology. That's sort of the attitude that Western culture has adopted over the last 100 years. And it becomes very pathological and problematic because, of course, when you take this sort of very narrow, divisionary approach to life, you lose sight of the highest, most important thing, which is holism and unity and love and your spiritual connection to life, not just through your head, but also through your body and through your emotional system and your intuition and your feminine side. But see, we've had this sort of schism between the feminine and the masculine, and the feminine has been demonized, the masculine has tried to dominate the feminine for a long time, and this creates problems. You're not a whole person this way. So remember in my wisdom episode, I talked about how wisdom is holistic. And wisdom, the essence of wisdom is that keen discernment. Well, and that sense of priorities, prioritizing the higher over the lower. So the foolishness of our current society is that we've actually prioritized the lower over the higher. We've prioritized technology and materialism and money and pleasure and hedonism and just like raw data and facts and information and technology above everything else. We've placed the lower over the higher. Whereas really, like for example, if you go into a university, what I mean is this: if you go into a university and you tell them, for example, that love is the most important thing for you to study in your university, they'll laugh at you. They'll say, "Oh, love, that's some sort of hippy-dippy stuff. We're real scientists here. We don't study love. We study like quarks and atoms and stuff." This is the definition of foolishness, this sort of attitude. To do good science, you actually have to be able to feel into reality with great sensitivity and mindfulness, not just think about it. And see, so when we have this sort of very rationalist, reductionist science become the new religion, sort of it's supplanting the old religions, that's a step up in a certain sense because the old religions are very problematic. I'm not saying that we should return to the old religions of centuries past, but when science becomes the new religion, otherwise called scientism, this creates all sorts of problems and pathologies. And we're seeing those pathologies everywhere, in medicine, in business, in universities, in government. We're seeing it. Now, the solution is not to go back, it's to find the next level of synthesis and holism, which starts to integrate the best from religion with the best from science, finding a new higher synthesis of those two. See, without holism, your life becomes petty, mechanical, utilitarian, demystified, and dysfunctional. You lose your connection to life. And that's why we have these epidemics of depression, suicide, opioid addiction. Because when you rob people of their spiritual connection, they just become zombies and robots. And then they kill themselves if they're not able to get the sort of success that they see people getting on TV. You literally feel disconnected and alienated from people, from society, from nature, from animals, from spirit, from goodness, from the self, from love, from God. That's what love is. Love is the connection to all those things. The more connected you are, the more in love you are with yourself, with the universe. What you want most of all is you want to feel infinitely connected to everything. That's love. That's what all human striving should be towards. It is towards that. The problem is that most humans don't understand it, and in most cases, we're striving for a very limited, partial love, right? So you experience dysfunction when you strive towards partial forms of love. So when you go shoot up some heroin, really what you're doing is you're finding a source to love, but it's very partial. When you are laughing at your political opponents and you're ridiculing them, that's a form of love, but a very partial and limited, dysfunctional form. When you're chasing money and trading stocks, that's a form of love. You're actually chasing love, but in a very dysfunctional manner that harms the rest of society. And that doesn't really get you that feeling that you want. What you really want is a feeling. You don't want a fact. You want a feeling. Think about it. Everything we seek in any domain of life is wholeness and unity. That's what we seek. For example, what do all the world religions seek? They all seek world domination. Every major religion wants to dominate every other, to completely exclude it and destroy it such that it becomes the one monolithic religion. Christianity wants that. Islam wants that. Probably many Buddhists in secret want that. See, what they're seeking there is they're seeking wholeness and unity, but they're seeking it in a dysfunctional manner. They're trying to access unity and wholeness through selfishness, which is completely ass backwards, and it will never work. So the solution here is to recognize that, hey, we could have a unity where Christianity dominates and destroys all the other religions and becomes the only one. That could be a sort of a monopoly or unity. Or we could actually, as Christians, learn to appreciate the other religions, see reality as being accessible through various different spiritual paths, not just one, not just Christianity. Christianity is not the ultimate one. It's just one out of many, out of hundreds. And we can see the richness and beauty and diversity of that, and we can embrace that whole thing as part of our religion, and so can all the other religions. And then that will be the highest unity and love. That will be the true religion, the religion that loves all other religions. See? But that's a counterintuitive move. And to do that move, you have to be very selfless. You have to surrender yourself, surrender your attachments and your beliefs in Christ as being the ultimate one, the one true Savior, or Muhammad being the last prophet. You have to surrender that belief in order to do what I'm saying. And you have to stop judging people who are not the same as you and your religion and your ethnicity. And you have to stop treating the Bible as the only word of God, but recognize there are many holy books that are also the word of God, equally as beautiful as the Bible. And you have to be able to recognize and admit certain contradictions and errors in the Bible. And you have to be able to admit that Christianity doesn't have all the answers. It has some of the answers, but other religions can have better answers in certain narrow domains. And that they all offer some valuable new perspective. But see, this is difficult to do. The mind has to surrender so much stuff. It has to be so selfless. It has to be so open to do that. That would be healing the world at the plane of religion. But what about business? In business also seeks unity and wholeness. That's what business seeks. Every business seeks to be a monopoly. That's the dream of every business person, is they want to monopolize their marketplace, be the best, crowd out all the competitors, buy them all up, if they're allowed to by the government. And then once they've mastered one field of business, they want to spread into other fields until they master every field and dominate everybody. And then ultimately we would just have one company, Amazon, that would own every other company. That's sort of the ideal of every business person. Of course, it doesn't have to be. You could recognize that this is actually a very selfish, pathological way of achieving unity, and it will never work. Instead, you can recognize that actually, to achieve a healthier unity within business, we have to recognize that it's healthy for us to have business competition and to have different sectors controlled by different companies, and that we shouldn't be buying up and using various kinds of antitrust methods to collude and then to squeeze our competitors out of the marketplace and so forth. But actually, we want a healthy economy, which has many different companies of different sizes, that creates more innovation, that will actually help to create a better economy for more people. People will have better wages. There will be more inventions, and it'll benefit everybody to do it that way. But see, that means you have to surrender your grand megalomaniacal ambitions of being the world's richest person or the world's biggest company. You have to think more holistically to do that. How about in the family? Every family seeks wholeness and unity. Nobody likes these family fights over Thanksgiving dinner. But that requires holism. Why is it so difficult to achieve unity within the family? because there's all these different actors with different agendas that are trying to do their own things and also at the same time trying to control each other, thinking that others are doing the wrong thing. And so there's fights. How about within science? Science is trying to achieve unity and wholeness. Scientists are always talking about a theory of everything. Science's whole mission is basically a theory of everything. Science wants to understand everything. But it thinks it can do that through the methods of science without realizing that it can't, because science is not everything. See, it's so simple. How can science understand everything when science isn't everything? The only thing that can understand everything is everything, not science. Science can understand some things, but science is limited. But science is so stuck in itself that it wants to understand everything only through science, while denigrating any other kind of understanding, or even denying that any other understanding is necessary beyond science. Well, when it takes that approach, it's self-defeating. And in this way, science will never have a theory of everything. A similar thing happens in mathematics. Mathematicians want to try to understand reality only as numbers, without realizing that they're just projecting numbers onto reality. See, you can understand a lot about nature through math. That's good. Math has been very effective, but it only gets you so far. If you think you can use math to understand everything, you're deluded. That is not a healthy way to approach reality. And in fact, right now, we're suffering pathologies of this. Science deeply suffers from this because in science, basically, current science and academia doesn't consider a thing true unless it can be quantified and put into an equation, which is called formalization. If you can't formalize something, it isn't considered true, which is just extremely unholistic, extremely reductionistic, extremely myopic, and it leaves out the most important aspects of reality. For example, you can't quantify love, which is what reality is. You also can't quantify infinity, speaking of which is what reality is. You can only quantify the finite, not the infinite. So, yeah, it's a very big problem for math. Infinity is not a math thing. Infinity is all of reality, of which math is just one subset. So don't confuse infinity with a number. It's not a number. It's not math. Now, we also have this problem within geopolitics. In geopolitics, what do people seek? They seek wholeness and unity. But they can seek it in more healthy or less healthy ways. If they seek it in less healthy ways, they want unity by dominating other countries, or by exterminating other countries and races and people. Or we can have a healthy geopolitics where we seek a unity through peace, through alliances, through mutual agreements, where we respect each other's boundaries and differences, and we don't try to dominate everybody else. We don't try to create an empire, a global empire. And we don't try to put our country above all the other countries. We recognize that every country is equally valid, has an equal validity to exist. Different cultures have different pros and cons, and they have a right to exist without being dominated by other cultures or undermined by other cultures. This is part of the pathology of the Trump policy of America first. See, when you put America first, you might think, well, that's going to be the best for America. That's going to make for the strongest America, right? If we put America first and we're just very selfish this way. But actually, it ends up boomeranging and having the opposite effect. Because when you put America first, everybody else in the world, of which there are more people than Americans are only like less than 1/10 of the whole planet are Americans. That means that the other 9/10 of the planet are going to rally together against these selfish Americans. They're going to make their own trade alliances, their own economic systems, their own currency. The dollar will lose its value in the long term. America will lose its spiritual standing in the world as a world leader. And other countries will just organize themselves into a more selfless alliance that will ultimately be stronger and more powerful than America, and America will wither away. That's effectively what America First gets you in the long run. That's what would happen if Trump's policies continued for 50 more years. Luckily, that didn't happen. But see, this is the short-sightedness of selfishness. When you're very selfish, you think you can get away with these kinds of things. You think, oh, we'll just be America First. We'll bomb anybody who disagrees with us. Fuck their alliances. We'll just force them to pay more and whatever. We'll manipulate their governments. It doesn't matter. But when you take this approach, it comes back to you. It's no different than being an asshole at your workplace. Maybe for a short while, being an asshole at your workplace or being an asshole in your relationship or in your family, maybe that'll get you some short-term benefits. But if you think more holistically, you realize it's going to be a net negative in the long run. Speaking of relationships, what do you seek in a relationship? You also seek unity. You seek peace in your intimate relationships, and you seek sexual unity. And there are healthy and unhealthy ways of going about this as well. What do you seek with your physical health? Unity. What do you seek with your psychological well-being? Unity. What do languages seek? Languages seek unity. Originally, if you look at languages in underdeveloped parts of the world, like in India, they don't have a single language. They have like 1,000 different languages in India. One of the challenges they face in India is how do you unify all the different dialects and sub-languages into one national language, because it's much easier to do business with a single language than with thousands. More developed countries like in America and Europe, they have unified their languages just to be a single language. Like the Russian language, the Japanese language, it's singular. There's not 100 different Japanese languages. Now, there's probably dialects and so forth, but they're so minor because it's better to have a unified language. And right now, English is sort of becoming the unified language of the world. But if America keeps behaving like assholes, maybe it won't be English. Maybe it'll be Chinese or something in the future. Who knows? There's a unification force within currency as well. We have all these different currencies around the world. But it's nice and more convenient to have a single currency. The dollar is sort of the unifying currency right now, but Bitcoin is coming up. People are saying maybe Bitcoin will be the universal currency of the future. Every currency is trying to fight for domination and unification to see which one comes out on top. This is evolution. This is life. We have unity and division. Unity and division. Unity and division in a fractal, infinite fractal, all the way up and down the different levels of the holarchy. Holons within holons within holons, fighting each other, unifying with each other, fighting each other, unifying with each other at all levels and scales, up and down. If you want a deeper discussion of that, check out my episode called Division versus Unity, where I go into a lot of depth on that. And also check out my episode called Understanding Duality, Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, where I go and give you a giant list of hundreds of different dualities that the mind creates and how to unify some of those together. That's a very powerful series, especially Part 3 of that series. Check that out. So another problem with reductionism is that it's easily exploited by devils. Because it's very easy to be selfish by deliberately limiting the scope of your holistic understanding to something very small and narrow. You carve out a little domain, and then you externalize, you create externalities outside of that circle such that you can benefit everything in the circle. This is a classic strategy. So we use our minds to carve up reality into tiny parts. Then it becomes easy for nobody to take responsibility for all the parts. As a whole, we can just take responsibility for one little part. And from this leads all sorts of pathologies. This is common, for example, within science departments, where we have subspecialties such that a scientist will only care about one little narrow thing, and anything beyond that, he doesn't care about. He doesn't study. He doesn't get paid for that. He views it as a distraction. But really, truly, for science to understand reality, it needs to interconnect all the different departments. You can't have separate little departments. Biology is really not separate from physics, separate from chemistry, separate from psychology, separate from philosophy. This creates a fractured view of nature. It's this sort of a phone tag game. You ever call a giant company, like your phone company, and you need something from them? You have some billing error. You call them up and the operator answers and you're like, hey, yeah, I got a billing problem here. You guys charged me too much last month on my phone bill. Who can I speak to about that? And the operator says, well, we're not the billing department here. We're just the sort of operator department. So I'll transfer you to billing. So she transfers you to billing. Then you call billing and you talk to them and you tell them about this and they say, oh, well, yeah, sorry, sir, but this isn't actually a billing problem. It's a technology problem. There was some technology error with the way that they were calculating your bill. So actually, we've got to transfer you to the technology department. So she transfers you over to the technology department. And there you talk to them and then they say, oh, no, this is not a technology problem. This is actually some other department's problem. So they transfer you to that one. And then that one transfers you back to the billing department and you just go around in a circle forever. And you can't get anywhere because nobody takes responsibility for the whole of the problem. See, your problem is not about a particular department. Your problem is your problem. It is what it is. I've experienced similar problems, for example, within medicine and health. I've been having some health problems over the last year, and I've experienced this situation where I go to one doctor, and he says, oh, I'm a generalist. You got to go to a specialist because you got a stomach problem, so you got to go to a stomach doctor. So I go to the stomach doctor, and he says, oh, well, this thing you're having, this is a psychology problem. You got to go to a shrink. And I say, no, I have a stomach problem. He says, no, you got to go to a shrink. Then if you go to a shrink, then the shrink will say, oh, this is not a shrink problem. This is a doctor problem. You got to go back to some other specialist. And so they just send you around in circles and you get nowhere. And nobody takes responsibility for the whole problem. And that's what is really important, is the whole problem, not just one facet of the problem. It's very convenient for a devil to have the excuse that, oh, this is not my problem, it's not my responsibility because it falls outside of my circle of concern. And of course, the devil deliberately draws the circle of concern extremely narrowly to serve his ego. His ego is that circle of concern. And it's usually a very dense, narrow ego. So the function of our work here and with spirituality is to expand that circle of concern until it becomes infinite. And then you have no more excuses. Everything is your problem. Everything is your responsibility. Another example is how easily single-issue voters get misled, for example, in American politics. This is a very popular way to manipulate people. Most people aren't very well educated about all the issues that are important to a well-functioning society. Instead, they have a couple of pet things that they care about, some hot button trigger issues. For example, I don't know how government works, but I want my guns. I don't know how government works, but I care about abortion being illegal. And so on those issues, it's very easy for a devil to manipulate me in that case, because all he has to do is fearmonger to me about how they're going to take my guns away. And then I'm going to go vote for anybody who's pro-gun, the most pro-gun, without considering, though, the larger issues at stake. Even if, let's say that the Second Amendment was very important to protect. But if you really think about it, is it really that important? It's important. Let's say it's important. But is it more important than the health of the entire country? Is it more important than the economy? Is it more important than healthcare? Is it more important than the environment? Is it more important than anti-corruption laws? Is it more important than campaign finance reform? Is it more important than the judicial system, right? So I'm like, obviously not. Even if you love guns just ridiculously much, still you have to admit it's not more important than all those other issues combined. So when you go to vote for president, for example, or for a senator, what you have to really consider is the totality of the situation, not a narrow issue. And so most people who vote, they vote on a single issue that they've been galvanized or fearmongered about, whether it's abortion, guns, or healthcare or something like that. But that's not what is most important. And so this leads to the political pathologies that we experience today. To have a well-functioning democracy, we need citizens that are so holistic that they care about the well-being and health of the entire country, but not even just the country, but actually the entire world. And they have to vote in that manner, and they have to be immune against fear-mongering and manipulation by devils on single narrow issues. Because a single issue is not important as all the issues, by definition. And hey, I mean, I understand. When I was younger, I loved guns. I was sort of a gun nut. Me and my friend was sort of into the military. He went to Iraq. But like in high school and in college, we would hang out together. We would create like fireworks and explosives and stuff. We would blow shit up. We would shoot guns. We would go to shooting ranges. We would talk about guns. We would have magazines and catalogs of guns. So like I get it. And I grew up in California. So in California, we had the strictest gun laws. And at that time, I thought like, well, why can't I have a fully automatic gun? Like I want that. That would be so cool. But then as I matured and my circle of concern expanded and my whole holistic thinking expanded, I realized that, I still think guns are cool. I'll go to a shooting range and shoot a fully auto. I did that recently in Vegas. But I also understand that my passion for guns is a much lower priority compared to other issues we've got going on. And no matter how much I love guns, my love for guns can't outweigh the love that parents have for their children when they get shot in schools, right? So you have to balance this stuff out. And what that required of me is that required more empathy, increasing my circle of concern, and setting aside my own agenda. It literally required me to become selfless in that area, where I had to say, you know what? As much as I love guns and as cool as it would be to own a fully automatic machine gun, maybe if we want to have a healthy, peaceful world, that's not the right way to go. And I have to surrender that for a greater good, for a greater harmony and balance. Because if I'm just going to be stuck on this one issue, that's going to distort my entire thinking about politics for the rest of my life. And think of how pathological that is. Yet this is exactly what we have going on with our politics these days. So the way that a devil operates, and by devil I just mean any deeply selfish organism, is that it creates a very narrow circle of concern within infinite consciousness, and then it defends that to the death. And it externalizes every single, how should I call it? Every single, it basically feeds off of its environment, right? When you draw that circle, you're getting nutrients from the environment, you're leaching those, and then you're excreting, literally, you're shitting out the stuff that's not useful to you into the environment. This is how an organism functions at the highest level. Well, that's literally how most of our corporations function, how most of our religions function, how most of our families, friends, and others function, is like this. This is called externalities. These are sort of the excrements of life. And it's these externalities you end up shitting on others. A good example of an externality is when a bird shits on your windshield. That was the bird's externality. And then you're not happy about it because your windshield got shat upon. You got to clean it up. Happened to me recently. So, but see, this is how most humans behave. They create these gross externalities, whether it's a company or a religion or a political party or an individual person, without being conscious or taking responsibility of the shit they put out, the collateral damage they cause. And then this creates a toxic commons for everybody to swim in. We're all swimming in the same pool and everyone's shitting in it. That's fundamentally our problem as humans. And so when you realize that takes holism to realize, right? Because if you lack holistic thinking, you can just think you can shit in the corner of the pool and everything will be okay. But when you realize we're all swimming in the same pool, you start to take responsibility for where you shit. And then the pool becomes more enjoyable to swim in for you and for everybody else. And it all begins with you. Because if you say, oh, Leo, I'm going to stop shitting in the pool only when everybody else does, well then, everyone else is going to say that too, because they think just like you, because they don't want to take responsibility. They don't want to lead. And then we swim in a shit-filled pool for the rest of our lives. So someone has to lead. It might as well be you. And of course, that means you have to be less selfish. That's what leadership is. Ta-da! Leadership is nothing other than selflessness. The more selfless you are, the better of a leader you're going to be. There's many other factors. I have some older videos about leadership, and I'll release some more videos in the future about leadership. That's an important topic, but that's the spirit of good leadership. There's also bad leadership. Bad leadership is extreme selfishness and narcissism, a la Hitler or Trump. See, self-bias privileges one part of the universe at the expense of another. Go check out my episode, Self-Bias, about that. Self-bias is very important here because self-bias is what creates the brokenness and is what creates the lack of holism. So to be more holistic, you have to surrender self-bias. You have to recognize that your mind carves up reality, not arbitrarily and not in accordance with the truth, but in whichever way serves your ego best. Your selfishness narrows the scope of your perspective. And this is the antithesis of holism. So the reason that most people aren't holistic is simply because they're too selfish. Another problem with a lack of holism is that narrow expertise is vulnerable to recontextualization. Go see my episode called Understanding Recontextualization. That's an important concept. What I mean by this is that you can discover some facts about the universe, but those facts, it doesn't matter what the facts are. It really matters what they mean to you and how you understand them and what you intend to do with them. But how you understand them and what they mean to you and what you intend to do with them and how important they are in the grand scheme of things only makes sense when you have the grand scheme of things. So a set of facts without its context doesn't mean very much. And when you're very narrow with your perspective on the universe, that is unholistic, that means that whatever understanding you have, whatever facts you have, they're always vulnerable to a radical recontextualization because the context can be changed or expanded, and that will completely change what your facts mean. It could turn them inside out, upside down, 180 degrees. And that's exactly what happens, for example, with science. Scientists grossly underestimate this problem of radical recontextualization. If you understand more about that, go see that episode. So, if you want a very solid, robust science, which is not fragile, it needs to be immune to radical recontextualization. And the only way you can be immune to radical recontextualization is by expanding your context until it's infinite. Which means you can't narrow your field down to one thing. Your field has to be the entirety of the universe as a whole. Think of it this way. If you had a binary choice between understanding a single part of the universe or the whole of the universe, but no individual singular part, which would you choose? So for example, if you're a mathematician, you could say, I want to understand all of mathematics perfectly. And if I was like a magic genie, I could just grant that wish to you right now. But if you understand all of mathematics perfectly, you won't understand physics. You won't understand cosmology. You won't understand philosophy. You won't understand relationships. You won't understand anything else. Just math. Or you could pick to understand all of physics, or all of economics, or all of psychology. Or you could wish for understanding the entire thing without understanding any particular one. Which would you choose? Can you see why it's wiser to choose the whole rather than any particular part? You see? There's a trade-off between understanding something in detail and understanding it from the big picture. The more big picture you're understanding, the less detail you have. The more detail you have, the less big picture understanding. It's sort of like zooming in or out of the earth. You can zoom all the way out of the earth and you will see the entire thing. But you won't see the ants on it. You won't even know there are ants on it. Or you can zoom into the earth, get all the way close to the ground, and you'll see the ants. But all you'll see is the ants, and you won't even know that there's an earth that they're on. So holism is zooming out. Although, of course, understand that these are not necessarily in opposition to each other. You can do both. But practically speaking, your human life and your resources are limited. So you have to be selective about which one is more important to you. Because you can't zoom in on everything. Also, notice that there's an interesting asymmetry here, is that when you zoom out, you only really zoom out once to see the whole earth. Whereas to zoom into the earth, you can zoom in on a million different things. You can zoom in on an ant, on a cow, on a human, on a turtle. You can keep zooming in on 1,000 different things. And you will still be infinitely far away from understanding the earth. But if you zoom out, that's a single operation. It kind of works like a cone. As it converges into a single unity. Whereas as it diverges into an infinite number of perspectives. So there's something powerful about the ultimate holism, because you actually zoom out so far that you grasp the whole thing, even though you don't understand all the details. And that's what omniscience, in a sense, is. So I want you to notice that there are two ways that you can use your thoughts. You can use thoughts to divide reality, and you can use thoughts to unite reality. And we, in our education, in our culture, are biased towards divisive type of thinking. So I could go around saying, oh, that's a monkey, that's a giraffe, that's a rhinoceros, and they're all separate creatures. I could think of them that way. Or I could say, oh, that's a monkey, that's a giraffe, that's a rhinoceros. They're all the same sorts of creatures. They're all part of life. They're all part of a single ecosystem. Divisive versus unitive thought. Take notice which kind of thought you use most of the time. For example, those are white people, those are black people, those are yellow people, those are Jews, those are Christians, those are Muslims, and they're all different. Or we can start to recognize how much they have in common. Which type of thinking do you think leads to more peace, and which leads to more conflict and war? And which one do you want? Do you want peace, or do you want conflict and war? How about in your relationships? Do you want to notice how much you two have in common, or how much you disagree? And which do you think will lead to more fights, and which do you think will lead to more sex? And which do you want, fights or sex? It's important to recognize that all thought is fundamentally dualistic and incomplete. Even unitive types of thinking, still very good. Much better than divisive, I would suggest. But even unitive thinking, even the most holistic of thinking, is still thinking, and thinking is inherently dualistic. Every thought divides reality in some way. Because every thought is a division within reality. Even a holistic thought is still divisive. it's still only a part of the whole. It's not the whole. You can't use the part to grasp the whole. But still, there are degrees of quality to thought. Not all thought is equally good. So, what I'm suggesting is that you incrementally increase the quality of your thinking, make it more holistic, more integrative, more unitive, without surrendering your ability to do analysis. Analysis is still important. So you got to have that flexibility. And then eventually you want to get so high in your holism that you recognize that even thought itself is too limited and too unholistic, and then you're able to transcend thought itself. And the highest holism doesn't occur within thought, it occurs within consciousness. The highest holism is infinite consciousness, which is beyond thinking. But even though I say that, thinking is still important because we don't really have an option in our society but to think. And therefore, it is important to talk about the different qualities of thought and improving your thought. So we're talking about holistic thinking here. If you want to talk about holistic consciousness, I've talked about it in other episodes. You get there through meditation, through yoga, through psychedelics. You don't get there through thinking so much. But holistic thinking is still a good place to start. See, the more holistic your understanding, the better you can manipulate systems towards health and the highest good without them boomeranging on you. So we can't create a healthy society without thinking. And we can't create a healthy society without holistic understanding of the systems we're dealing with. Another feature of holistic thinking is that it can foresee the counterintuitive twists and turns that reality takes. For example, in the way that freedom creates enslavement. A lot of libertarians stumble into this problem. They can't see the counterintuitiveness of freedom. They think that just absolute freedom is going to lead to the highest good, but it doesn't, because if you minimize government completely, you eliminate the state, you eliminate all taxation, and everybody is just free to do what they will and just live on their land and own their own property, as libertarians envision. But what's going to happen is that some of those people are going to use that freedom to enslave other people. And you as a libertarian would say, no, but that's not libertarian of them to do. But they don't care because they have a different moral system. So they will still enslave you. And then what you'll realize is that your libertarianism and your cry for absolute freedom is actually foolishness because it boomerangs on itself. Freedom is not an absolute thing. Freedom, as humans desire it, has to be delicately balanced and harmonized with restrictions and regulations to ensure that your freedom doesn't turn into enslavement. Because that's literally what absolute freedom means. Absolute freedom means I have the freedom to enslave you, and you have the freedom to cry about it, and I have the freedom not to care. That's true freedom. But it takes a very holistic understanding to see that. So complex problems require holistic solutions. And holism generates more robust solutions than otherwise, which is a practical reason for why you should care about it. Now let's start to wrap up by talking about why the highest intelligence is holistic. So intelligence itself, I'm claiming, is a holistic thing inherently. When we say someone is intelligent or more intelligent than somebody else, what we really mean is that their intelligence is more holistic. In a sense, you can think of intelligence as holistic pattern recognition, which leads to insight, which is also basically identical to intuition. It's the ability to interconnect dots and to grasp the entirety of a situation in one single snapshot, not in bits and pieces. It's to see the whole picture of a situation. For example, you walk into a room, like let's say you walk into your mother's house and you see a gun on the floor and you see blood splattered on the carpet and you see the vase has been broken and you see the door has been busted in, the window has been broken. You see that, and then intelligence is the ability to interconnect all of those separate elements and to recognize a crime has occurred. Whereas a lack of intelligence is to walk in there and to just kind of look around and to see these different things and to not be able to interconnect them all together and to be clueless about what's going on. There are a few other features of the highest intelligence. Highest intelligence includes the ability to see context very deeply, the ability to go meta and to transcend, the ability to self-reflect, the ability to take on multiple perspectives and higher perspectives, the ability to be unbiased and selfless, and equal concern for all levels of the hierarchy. I want you to contemplate for yourself why these things are the case as you contemplate what intelligence is and as you experience higher levels of intelligence. But I'll give you some answers that I have come to in my own contemplations. So, why, for example, is seeing context so important for the highest intelligence? Well, it's because if you don't see the context of a thing, you can easily get fooled by a thing. You can easily misunderstand what the true nature of a thing is by missing its context. Just because I cut out a single sentence from a book, I can use that single sentence to completely misrepresent what that book is about. To understand that single sentence, I would have to read the whole book to really understand its context, or at the very least, read the paragraph or the page or the chapter that that sentence is on. So there's no way that the highest intelligence can be non-context aware, because that's how foolishness happens. And the highest intelligence can't be foolish. Okay, how about the ability to go meta and to transcend? Why is that an inherent feature of the highest intelligence? So the ability to transcend or to go meta is to step outside of some system that you're thinking about or that you're in. Really, we're talking about awareness, self-awareness. So the reason that it's important for the highest intelligence to be able to go meta is because if it doesn't go meta, it's enwrapped and entangled in the thing that it's trying to understand. So, for example, I could be using language right now as I'm speaking and not be meta about it, and then I would just be sort of using this language unconsciously. Whereas if I was using this language in a meta way, I would be conscious of the fact that I'm using language as I'm talking about language. Creates a sort of a self-awareness loop. And this is a feature of high intelligence. Because see, if you're interacting in the world and you're treating the world as just some object that you're interacting with, but you're not taking into consideration your own self in relation to that thing, then you don't have an understanding of the entire situation and you're going to make foolish mistakes. So you need to be able to interconnect everything for the highest intelligence. The more you interconnect things, the more intelligent you are. And so you have to be able to interconnect the fact that you are participating in the creative process of the universe. So it's not just that I'm using language, I'm actually constructing this language as I'm going, and I need to be aware of that. Likewise, when I'm doing science, it's not just that I'm doing science. I need to be able to go meta on science and recognize that, yes, I'm doing science, but I'm also creating the science as I'm doing it. And I have to take responsibility for that. And for that, I need to be able to go meta and to transcend science. I got to do meta science, epistemology, metaphysics. Why is the ability to self-reflect a feature of the highest intelligence? Basically for the same reason. Self-reflection is basically a form of going meta on your own self. Ultimately, when you become completely selfless, you realize that there's nothing but the self. It's sort of a strange loop and an inversion where it goes full circle. You have the infinite self. Everything is the self. When you realize you're not the human self, that means that you're the universe. That's what it means. So if you are the universe, if all there is the self and nothing else, that means the highest intelligence must necessarily be able to recognize and reflect on itself. Because if it's not reflecting on itself, then what is it trying to understand? You're always trying to understand some aspect of yourself, no matter what you're trying to understand. If you're trying to understand evil, really, you're just trying to understand more about yourself, because you are evil. If you're trying to understand good, you're trying to understand more of yourself, because you're good. If you're trying to understand women, you're trying to understand yourself. If you're trying to understand men, if you're trying to understand a dog, all of these are just aspects of consciousness. It's the universe trying to understand itself. So the universe, at its highest level of intelligence, needs to be able to self-reflect. And that's one of the characteristics of wisdom. This is actually a feature of consciousness, is its ability to self-reflect, because consciousness is itself. What about perspective? Why is it important for the highest intelligence to be able to take multiple perspectives? Because if you're only taking one perspective, by definition, that's a limitation of all the other perspectives that consciousness could experience. Consciousness has an infinite capacity to generate perspectives, literally infinite perspectives. It's a field of infinite perspective. So if you're only taking one perspective on a thing, you're seeing it from a very narrow, limited angle. Similar to like if we were looking at an elephant and you only looked at it from a single angle, you wouldn't see the whole elephant. You'd only see one part of the elephant, and that would not give you a deep understanding of the whole elephant. To understand the whole elephant, you really want to have one of those matrix cameras where you can just like circle all around the elephant from every angle, even go inside of the elephant. Zoom in, zoom out. Then you can appreciate what the elephant really is. So the highest intelligence needs to be able to be so flexible that it can take all of these different perspectives. This is why we talk about the sort of perspectival nature of reality. Go check out my episode called What If Reality is Nothing But Perspective, where I talk about that. One of the biggest problems with science is that materialistic science does not really understand just how multi-perspectival reality is. And this creates all sorts of problems for it. Because science wants to remove the subjective element from reality, but reality is absolutely subjective. So what are you trying to do? You're fooling yourself. And this problem happens because science is not able to self-reflect sufficiently, and it's not able to go meta sufficiently to understand that subjectivity is all that there is to reality. There's nothing else but subjectivity. And so because of this, science is not operating at the highest level of intelligence. The highest level of intelligence would understand this. But the only way to understand this is to go meta, to self-reflect, and to see reality from all these different perspectives. And now finally, why is the ability to be unbiased and selfless so crucial to the highest intelligence? Because ultimately everything is yourself. Ultimately everything is one. So really, ultimately, it makes no difference whether you like that thing, or hate this thing, or hate this thing. All of these are just biases. These biases are what selfishness is. Selfishness is saying that, well, I like this part of consciousness, but I hate that part of consciousness. This part of consciousness serves me, that part of consciousness doesn't serve me. But look at it like this. If you recognize that you are the entire thing, then how can anything serve you or not serve you? How can you really care about one thing more than another thing? It makes no sense. That only makes sense from the limited ego's perspective. So the only way you can really be selfish and biased is when you fool yourself into thinking that you're some limited aspect of consciousness and not the entire thing. If you realize you're the entire thing, then all the biases become groundless and unjustified. And that's the highest intelligence. The highest intelligence in the universe is selflessness and a lack of all biases. And that's what God is. God is infinite consciousness, infinite intelligence, infinite selflessness. Because if you were infinitely intelligent, why would you ever be selfless? It's stupid. The only reason you're selfish is because your consciousness is limited. If your consciousness was unlimited, you would never be selfless. You would never be selfish because selfishness just creates suffering. And it's a limitation of love. And if you were infinitely intelligent, why would you be anything or choose anything else but love? Are you getting this? This is deep stuff. This is like advanced calculus level stuff. To understand this. On the other hand, it's all very simple when you finally experience it. The problem is that you're not conscious enough to experience it yet. Maybe try a psychedelic to get it. So here I have a picture for you. I love this picture of what intelligence looks like and what holism looks like. So we have two circles. One of the circles is very filled in with a lot of interconnections, and the other one has a few interconnections, but mostly dark black space. So this actually comes from a study that they did on psilocybin mushrooms, magic mushrooms. Those people who take the mushrooms experience these deep interconnections. And those people who don't take the mushrooms, the placebo, the sober state, the quote-unquote sober state, the state you're in right now, if you're not on mushrooms, is the one with the very few interconnections. This represents your mind. This is sort of a semantic map of the mind. Different parts of your mind become more and more interconnected on psychedelics. And that's why psychedelics are so important to this work and are so powerful. Because all that they do is they basically just change the neurotransmitters, upgrade them to ones that offer more interconnections, and they just interconnect more and more of your mind together to the point where ultimately the interconnections become infinitely dense. And you can imagine that when your consciousness becomes completely infinite, every corner of the universe interconnects with itself infinitely, such that this circle becomes just a completely solid, glowing, white orb of pure interconnectedness. And this is God, love, intelligence, beauty, infinity, eternity, the self. That's what you are. That's your true highest self. At this level of interconnectedness and holism, literally the boundaries and physical divisions of everything in the universe collapses. It's what you might imagine the universe was before the Big Bang, when every molecule was smushed into every other one. Literally, the boundary and difference between you and your mother and your father and Hitler and Trump and dogs and cats and aliens and planets and stars and love and hate and good and evil, all these boundaries are completely meaningless because you're so conscious that all of it is you, equally you, without any bias or partiality or favoritism. And that's the Godhead. That's infinite consciousness. That's complete awakening to yourself as God. And then there are many lower scales of this sort of consciousness, all the way down to humans, as you are right now, and then down to cats and dogs and ants, and lower and lower and lower and lower. So it goes as low as you want, and it goes as high as you want. And this complete interconnectedness, it goes on forever. You might think it's a static object, but it's really not a static object. It's like an infinite well down which you fall. It's an infinite well of love, and you just keep falling deeper and deeper into this love. It becomes more and more interconnected forever. Pretty cool, huh? And you can experience that for yourself. What I'm talking about now, I'm talking from direct experiences that I've had. This is something I've experienced. This is something meditators and yogis have experienced. This is something that you can experience on psychedelics or through various other ways. So that's it. This sort of shows you the highest level of holism. Now, of course, most holism is much lower than that. Holistic thinking is far shy of this completely solid sphere of infinite interconnectedness, but it points in that direction, just so you know. Now, if you love Actualized.org, you probably love the holism of it. And that has been one of the guiding drives behind my work, is holism. When I started Actualized.org, one of the things that motivated me so much to do all this content in such depth is that I really didn't see any deeply holistic books, teachings, or teachers. Everything I saw when I started to learn about self-help and personal development, it always underwhelmed me. I mean, there was great stuff I read and studied, and it was all important, but it always left me feeling lacking, like there's something lacking. It's not holistic enough for me. I wanted the highest holism, and I just didn't find it anywhere in books or in science or in religion or in philosophy. Everywhere I looked, I never got enough holism. And then only now in hindsight can I understand why that is. Because really what I wanted was infinite holism. I didn't know that's what I wanted, but I intuited it somewhere deep down that that's what I wanted. And so I just started creating Actualized.org content in that direction, not really understanding where it would ultimately lead me to. And ultimately led me to that infinite white ball of solid love. And that's ultimately where I hope it leads you to as well. But it's a long road to get there, so we're breaking it up into chunks here. But there's a cost to holism. See, it doesn't come free. If holism is so rare, you might wonder, why is it so rare? What's the cost that people are not willing to pay? Well, here are a couple of them. One cost is that you can't break holism down into bite-sized chunks very easily. It's hard to do episodes of holism. It's hard to do 10-minute videos. That's why my videos are so long. And they require putting a lot of pieces together and holding them in your mind at once. There's a lot of moving pieces to reality. And so my episodes are long because I'm trying to bring them all together into your mental RAM, so to speak, so you can capture it in maybe an hour or two. You're not going to be able to hold it for very long. Maybe for a few hours you'll hold it and then you'll drop out of it. It's also mentally overwhelming to keep all these moving pieces in your mind. I mean, it's a lot easier to just be like a physicist and to only know physics stuff and nothing else. Life is so much easier that way. You can be such a devil and you have such plausible deniability for being a devil. You can avoid responsibility that way. You can avoid the struggle and difficulty of putting all these contradictory worldviews and perspectives together, which is challenging and confusing and frustrating as fuck. But you don't get to see the big picture. And what you really want, especially if you're a physicist, is you want to see the big picture. You want to see this big white ball of love. That would be the culmination of all your physical study. That is the ultimate physics. But you're so myopic, you don't even understand that. If I told this to a physicist in some university, he would just dismiss me as a fool. So that's one cost. Another very great cost to holism is it requires selflessness. A selfish, needy person can't be concerned about anything very far beyond himself. And holism requires a transcendence of one's survival, of one's biases. Because at the highest holism, you are completely unbiased. Consciousness is completely unbiased. At the highest level of holism, there literally isn't any difference between you getting raped and you getting tortured and you getting a birthday cake. There's no difference between these things at the highest level of holism. This is very threatening to the ego. This is very threatening to people. Even to say this already, some of you listening will take offense at what I just said because it's a threat to your ego. And I get that. But then again, we're trying to be holistic here. See, holism requires surrendering yourself until ultimately you surrender yourself so deeply that there's nothing left to surrender. And then you die. You literally die for the sake of holism. That's if you want to go all the way. You don't have to go that far. You can stop far short of that. Most people will. But if you want to go all the way, that would be going all the way. But even just to increase your holism, even if you don't go all the way, just to increase it still requires surrendering something. To be holistic within the field of religion requires you surrender certain prejudices you have about your favorite religion. To be holistic within science, you'd have to surrender certain biases and prejudices you have for science. Maybe you think physics is better than biology. Well, you're going to have to surrender that if you want to be holistic with science. Maybe you think science is better than spirituality. Well, you're going to have to surrender that if you're going to want to integrate those two together. If you want to be holistic within politics, you're going to have to surrender all sorts of political biases you have and prejudices. This is tough work. And almost nobody wants to do it because most people are just so selfish. They're wrapped up in their own survival and they think that there's nothing more to do in life. Well, I'm presenting you with an alternative possibility, the selfless life. Not selfless for the sake of others, selfless for the sake of yourself. Paradoxically. You're not doing it for anyone else but you. That's the tricky thing about selflessness. People misunderstand. They think that, well, I'm being selfless just so that I could feel good because other people think I'm selfless. No, that's not it. That's not true selflessness. That's selfishness. True selflessness is when you honestly want to surrender every bias you have about how you see reality. Think about that. Think about that possibility. Imagine if just you forgot about everything else that was important in your life. The money, the sex, the drugs, the business, the career, the house, the children. Surrender all that. Forget about it. It's not important anymore. The only thing that matters to you is to be completely unbiased in how you see yourself. That would be true selflessness. And that would lead to the ultimate love. Because you see, the reason you can't love everybody and everything is because you're so partial. You're always judging everything as being good or bad. And that's because yourself needs to survive as that little thing that it is. And so as you can see, what happens is that as you surrender more and more of your partialities and biases, you have to surrender more of yourself. And as you do that, the distortions that obscured your vision of yourself and of reality, they fall away, they clear, the fog clears, the clouds clear, and what you see is you approach closer to truth. You become closer and closer and closer to truth until finally, at that moment when you completely surrender every single bias you have and every single personal preference for good and evil, and you completely surrender yourself, at that moment you die and you become the truth. And the truth is complete selflessness, love. And that's God. And at that moment, you become God realized. You realize what God is. And then everything makes sense. But the cost is everything you held dear. The cost is all of your selfishness. So the reason people don't realize God is because they're just too fucking selfish. And when people suggest, hey, you can realize God by being less selfish, they say, but Leo, why would I choose to be less selfish? What would I get out of it? Leo, tell me the benefits I will get from being less selfish, and maybe I'll try it. See, you can't cure a person like that. There can't be a reason for pursuing selflessness, because if there was a reason, that reason would be selfish. That's the whole point and power of selflessness, is that it has no reason. You don't select to be selfish, or rather, you don't select to be selfless because it's going to do something good for you. You select to be selfless because you want to be selfless, and that is its own reward. That is the highest wisdom, is to see that. This is the most counterintuitive thing about the universe, is the decision to become selfless. Because everything in your body and in your mind is screaming for you to be more selfish. You think that by being extremely selfish, you're going to get everything you want, and that's going to be the best survival strategy for you, and actually it ends up being the opposite. So now you understand why holistic thinking is rare. All right, there's still more to say though, so make sure you stick around for the next part coming up next week, where we will talk about, actually a little bit more practically, we're going to talk about how to develop holistic thinking. We're going to go into some more examples and problems with a lack of holism and how to apply some of these things to social issues. So stay tuned. All right, that's it. I'm done here. Please click that like button for me and come check out Actualized.org right there. That's my website. On the website, you will find my book list, which will help you to develop your holism. Make sure you read some of those books. It's really important for this work that you don't just watch, but you also read books. It's not enough just to listen to me. You can find my life purpose course, which helps you to develop holism within your career track and your business and your profession. And then you can find my blog where I post exclusive video content. Go check it out. I recently posted a few exclusive videos there, some deep ones. Don't miss those. You can only find those on the blog. And you can find the forum there and other things that I'll be releasing in the future. And then finally, if you'd like, you can support me at patreon.com/actualized. That's it here for here. Stay tuned for the next part next week.